What options are left to alleviate the pressure on Canadian lumber producers? This comes as the total effective tax burden imposed by the US on the average Canadian mill has risen to more than 45%.
Canada did not declare a trade war. They did not need to. What they did was far more sophisticated. They raised export prices on lumber flowing into the United States, and Washington has almost no way to respond. This is not about wood. This is about a fundamental shift in how economic power works in the 21st century, and if you are buying a home, building a home, or renting in America, you are about to feel it. Here is what most people missed. Canada supplies a massive share of the softwood lumber used in American residential construction, including single-family homes, modular housing, and disaster rebuilding, and the wood framing your walls, your roof, and your floors crosses the border from Canadian mills. For years, the United States has imposed duties on Canadian lumber, and the total tax burden on an average Canadian mill now exceeds 45%. Ottawa has watched these costs pile up, squeezing their producers, while American tariffs remained firmly in place. So Canada changed the game. Instead of retaliating with their own tariffs, which would trigger formal disputes and legal challenges, Ottawa simply recalibrated export pricing with higher prices for American buyers that were immediate, effective, and almost impossible to challenge under existing trade rules. This distinction matters enormously. Under World Trade Organization frameworks, tariffs are visible, contestable, and negotiable, but pricing decisions by exporters operate in a legal gray zone with no tariff line to counter, no dispute mechanism to activate, and no obvious violation to litigate. Canada found the soft spot in the global trade architecture and pressed it. The impact landed first where it hurts most, which is the American housing market. Lumber is not a marginal input, it is foundational, and when material costs rise at the source, the effects multiply through the entire construction supply chain, and even a modest percentage increase at the lumber level can add thousands of dollars to the final price of a home once you factor in labor financing, permits, and margins. For builders, this means immediate recalculation, and projects that were viable last month now sit on the edge of profitability, while developers face an impossible choice to absorb the costs, raise prices, or delay construction entirely, and many are choosing to wait. Across states that rely heavily on Canadian lumber imports, construction firms have begun pausing procurement decisions, not because supply disappeared, but because price certainty vanished, and when you cannot predict your input costs, you cannot commit to contracts, and when you cannot commit to contracts, projects stall. Delayed projects mean delayed hiring, reduced overtime, and layoffs rippling through subcontractors, transport companies, and local suppliers, because construction is labor-intensive, and when it slows, entire regional economies feel the pun's drag. The financial sector is not immune either, because lenders underwriting residential and commercial projects must now reassess risk assumptions, which slows loan approvals, tightens terms, and shelves marginal developments. And here is where it hits ordinary Americans directly. Higher construction costs eventually translate into higher rents, and in fast-growing metro areas where new housing supply is critical to keeping prices stable. Fewer units getting built means tighter rental markets, and that pressure falls hardest on lower and middle-income renters who are already stretched thin. Housing affordability was already one of the most politically sensitive economic issues in America, and Canada just made it worse, and they did it without firing a single tariff. For policymakers in Washington, this creates an unusually complex problem because in a conventional trade war, the United States responds with counter tariffs, formal disputes, or negotiated exemptions, but those tools do not fit here. There is no new tariff to mirror, no quota to contest, and no explicit rule violation to challenge. What exists instead is a market-driven adjustment that produces real economic pain inside the United States while sitting just outside the reach of traditional trade remedies. The political calculus is brutal because an aggressive response risks escalating tensions with one of America's closest allies and largest trading partners. But doing nothing looks weak, especially to voters watching home prices climb and construction jobs disappear. Housing affordability consistently ranks among the top concerns for American households, and any policy that inflates prices further or appears ineffective at controlling them carries electoral consequences, particularly in swing states, where construction and real estate drive local economies. At the state level, reactions are splitting along predictable lines as states dependent on Canadian lumber imports want relief, while states with domestic timber industries see opportunity in higher import prices but lack the capacity to scale up quickly enough to fill the gap. This internal division limits Washington's room to maneuver because there is no unified domestic position, which makes any federal response politically risky and strategically uncertain. What makes this moment significant is not the price increase itself, but what the price increase represents, because Canada has signaled a fundamental shift in how resource-exporting countries view their role in the global economy. Rather than competing on volume by selling as much as possible at market prices, Ottawa is prioritizing value capture and economic sovereignty, and they are treating lumber not as a commodity but as a strategic asset. This approach carries risks for Canada because higher prices can invite substitution, encourage investment in competing sources, and potentially reduce long-term market share. But those are calculated risks, and Canada is betting that its resources remain critical enough to sustain demand, at least in the medium term. For the United States, the implications extend far beyond lumber because if pricing power proves effective as a tool of influence, other nations will take notice, including energy exporters, critical mineral suppliers, and agricultural baby producers. And any country that controls inputs America depends on could explore similar strategies. The old trade war playbook of tariffs, counter-tariffs, and public confrontation may be increasingly obsolete, while the new playbook is quieter, more persistent, and harder to counter because control over inputs is becoming more valuable than control over markets. Decades of economic integration delivered efficiency and lower prices for American consumers, but that integration also created dependencies that are difficult to unwind quickly. Expanding domestic lumber production takes years of investment, regulatory approval, workforce development, and environmental review, and these are not levers you can pull overnight. So the question facing American policymakers is not whether Canada's move was justified or provocative, but whether the United States is prepared for a world where these moves become common, where allies assert their economic interests without warning, and where strategic inputs get repriced without negotiation. The housing market is feeling it now, but this is bigger than lumber and bigger than construction, because this is about who sets the terms of access to the resources that power the American economy. And right now, that answer is shifting, quietly, deliberately, and faster than most people realize. What happens when your closest ally becomes your most sophisticated economic competitor? That is the question America must answer next.